Welcome to Legat's presentation about Council's alcohol and other drugs policy and procedure. This is a new policy and procedure relating to alcohol and other drugs at the workplace, which your Council, following consultation with you, has decided to adopt. This presentation has been prepared by Legat for all the Councils to use during their implementation of this new policy and procedure.
You will already have had an opportunity to read and consider the alcohol and other drugs policy and procedure. The purpose of this session is to further assist you to understand this policy and procedure and how they apply to you and your employment with Council. In particular, at the end of this session, you should understand when it's appropriate to use or possess alcohol or other drugs in the workplace, your responsibilities under the alcohol and other drugs policy and procedure, the rights Council has under the policy and procedure, and the possible consequences of you breaching the policy or procedure. If you have any questions about this policy and procedure, you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of this session. You will then be asked to complete some comprehension test questions. If you have further queries or concerns about how the policies or procedures apply to you, then it is important that you raise those concerns with your supervisor or manager and obtain the clarification that you need.
Before we begin, it is important to make sure that we remember key terms and concepts used in the suite of policies and procedures. Policies, procedures and advisory documents are the three key types of documents that set the standards of workplace behaviour and provide processes for you to follow to ensure that your workplace behaviour is lawful and meets Council's expectations. As you can see in the pyramid, the policies sit at the top of the tier. It is a central document and explains what Council is trying to do by introducing the policy and why it is necessary. Council's policies, including the alcohol and other drugs policy, apply to you as lawful and reasonable directions or instruction.
Procedures are Tier 2 documents. They contain a lot more detail on how to do something. They may include a series of steps or a series of topics with a logical process to be followed. Procedures are not contractual but provide a good guide in terms of what your employer expects you to be doing and contain lawful and reasonable directions. Advisory documents are also known as Tier 3 documents and may contain anything from data collection, the types of forms that you use to record incidents or accidents, to processes that you have used when going about your work. Advisory documents do not override the policy, but can be used to assist to help you to understand how a particular policy is to be applied.
There are a number of key definitions and terms that apply consistently throughout all of the documents, including the alcohol and other drugs policy and procedure. It is important to understand these terms in order to understand the policies, procedures and advisory documents. Because you are already familiar with these terms from the induction training, I will just explain each one briefly. Let's start with related Council document. These are the documents listed at the front of the policy and include the Council's other policies and procedures. They are referred to because an issue may have a number of elements and one of these other documents may be relevant to the management of that issue.
The term applicable law means each and every legislation that applies to you. You don't have to be a legal expert to understand what laws apply to you on a daily basis. For example, without having a detailed understanding of road laws, you know that driving over the legal limit is against the law. The term infringing workplace behaviour can be anything you do or fail to do which amounts to a breach of a Council policy, your contractual obligations or misconduct at common law. The term manager supervisor means anyone with management or supervisory responsibilities for others. The term other persons in the workplace refers to people at the workplace such as ratepayers and visitors who may not have the same obligations as employees but have to follow the directions of the council while they're in the workplace. The term worker obviously refers to employees, but it also refers to contractors, subcontractors, volunteers and people on work experience.
You will remember from your previous training that policies and procedures do not just apply in the traditional workplace. They will also apply when you are in places that you may not consider to be your workplace, such as outside your office or beyond the site in which you normally work. The slide shows that workplaces can extend from behaviour in the office or on site all the way out to private activities that impact on work. An example of this may be making comments on social media that affects performance of your work, your relationship with other council workers, or affects council's reputation. Let's now move on to the alcohol and other drugs policy and procedure. The alcohol and other drugs policy and procedure sets out council's expectations of workers and other people at the workplace about acceptable consumption, use or possession of alcohol and other drugs at the workplace. It also sets out how council will manage unacceptable consumption, use or possession.
So let's first consider the obligations and expectations surrounding alcohol in the workplace. The basic rule is that workers must not present to work if they are either under the influence of alcohol or if they exceed the fit for work limits. A worker is under the influence of alcohol if they are unable to perform their duties because of their level of intoxication. For example, a person will be unable to perform their duties if they are visibly intoxicated or observably affected by alcohol. A worker breaches the alcohol fit for work limits if their blood alcohol count exceeds the relevant limit. This will be discussed more on the next slide.
So what are fit for work limits? The fit for work limits are different depending on whether you are classified as a worker with prescribed limits, a high-risk worker, or simply a worker. To find out which classification you are, refer to the schedule at the back of the policy or ask your direct manager. The reason workers are classified into these categories is to reflect the different level of risk and different statutory requirements that attach to each position. Workers with prescribed limits are workers with roles that have specific regulatory requirements about alcohol consumption. Their alcohol fit for work limit will be the BAC limit prescribed by the relevant legislation, rules or guidelines. For example, lifeguard accreditation may require that a lifeguard has a BAC of 0.00 when performing their role. This means that the alcohol fit for work limit for lifeguards will be a BAC of 0.00. BAC is the blood alcohol content measured from a breath test or saliva test. Most people are familiar with this in relation to the road rules and the fact that to lawfully drive a car, your BAC cannot exceed 0.05.
High-risk workers are workers who have a role where alcohol consumption has an increased risk. For example, individuals who regularly drive vehicles or operate heavy machinery may be classified as high-risk workers. A high-risk worker may also be someone who is employed in childcare. As you can see in this slide, the alcohol fit for work limit for high-risk workers is a BAC of 0.02. If your role is not included in either Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 of the policy, then you are classified as a worker. The alcohol fit for work limit for workers is a BAC of 0.05. It is really important that you understand which fit for work limit applies to you and you do not exceed those limits to ensure that you don't breach Council's policy.
Now we understand the appropriate alcohol thresholds for performing work, let's move on to the possession and use of alcohol at the workplace. The basic rule is that workers and other persons at the workplace must not possess, sell, distribute or consume alcohol in the workplace. There are 3 exceptions to this rule. Firstly, if your manager or supervisor gives you permission. This might be for Friday night drinks or a birthday celebration. Secondly, if you are possessing alcohol at work but do not intend to drink it at the workplace and in fact do not drink it at the workplace. This will cover situations where you may have purchased a bottle of wine at lunchtime for a party on the weekend and have to take it home that night. Lastly, if it is related to or in connection with an authorised function. These functions are authorised by a nominated council delegate and might include the purchase, storage and sale of alcohol at an authorised event at the town hall.
This policy also includes a number of guidelines for running an authorised function. If you are the nominated council delegate, make sure you familiarise yourself with this and refer to it each time you organise or authorise an authorised function. Firstly, the authorised function must be supervised by the nominated council delegate. They are responsible for the overall service of alcohol, including determining whether workers can return to work and a general duty to arrange transport for those who cannot drive. Any authorised function must comply with responsible service of alcohol rules. This includes rules such as limiting alcohol consumption to workers over 18, only moderate consumption of alcohol, and not encouraging excessive consumption. Similarly, drinking games are prohibited at authorised functions and non-alcohol options such as soft drink, tea and coffee must be provided. An authorised function may occur at the workplace or at a public location. Remember, your workplace may extend beyond the office. If you attend an authorised function, you must not drink alcohol if you are under 18 or on your P plates and intend to drive home, and you must ensure that you only consume alcohol in moderation. You also have to comply with reasonable directions given to you at the function. This might include directions to leave the function, to not return to work after, or to stop drinking alcohol.
In the policy and procedure, drugs include illicit drugs, prescription drugs and over-the-counter drugs. When we refer to drugs, we are referring to medication or other substances, whether they are illegal or not, which have a physiological effect on you if they are used. Prescription drugs are drugs that you need to have a prescription from your doctor for. And OTC drugs are those drugs that you can obtain without a prescription over the counter from your pharmacy or supermarket. So, like the basic rules for alcohol, workers must not present to work if they are either under the influence of drugs or if they exceed the fit for work limits.
Unlike the alcohol fit for work limits, the fit for work limits for illicit, prescription and over-the-counter drugs are the same for all categories of workers. The fit for work limit for illicit drugs is 0. Workers must not have illicit drugs in their system at any time during which they are at work or carrying out work. The fit for work limit for prescription or over-the-counter drugs allows an amount in a worker's system that does not make them unfit for work or affect their ability to perform work safely. This will be different for each individual worker and depend on the type of medication, the dose and the cumulative effect of the medication.
Because of this, you have a number of obligations under this policy in order to manage the risk of being unfit for work or being unable to perform work safely due to medication. These obligations include to advise your manager or supervisor when taking medication that may make you unfit for work or affect your ability to work safely. To discuss possible side effects of any medication with your doctor. To take the medication as recommended by your prescription pharmacist or the manufacturer. And finally, to report any side effects.
Now, some further rules to remember. You are never permitted to possess, sell, distribute or consume illicit drugs in the workplace. And remember that your workplace may extend beyond the office. You are never permitted to sell or distribute prescription drugs to any other person in the workplace. And you are not permitted to sell or distribute over-the-counter drugs to any other person at the workplace. The only exception in relation to the over-the-counter drugs is if you are a designated first aid officer, where you are permitted to distribute over-the-counter drugs in accordance with that role only.
Now let's turn to alcohol and drug testing in the workplace. Council can require you to participate in alcohol and drug testing. This slideshow shows the different types and circumstances in which alcohol and drug testing may occur. Let's start with pre-employment testing. The Council can require a worker to take an alcohol or drug test before their employment so that Council can determine whether the worker can safely perform that role. The Council can also require you to undertake a random alcohol or drug test at any time before you start work or during your workday or shift. The Council can also require you to participate in casual alcohol and or drug test if you are involved in a workplace incident or if a manager reasonably believes you are either affected by alcohol or drugs or have exceeded the fit for work limits. This might be, for example, where they have smelt alcohol on your breath. The Council can also require you to undertake prescribed testing if you have previously returned a test which exceeded the fit for work limits. This may be a series of scheduled or random tests as part of a rehabilitation program, return to work program, or as action taken under fitness for work policy. The Council can also require a worker to participate in compliance testing. This is where Council legally is required or permitted to undertake testing. Lastly, Council will provide voluntary self-testing facilities at nominated locations. Obviously, Council cannot require workers to undertake a voluntary test, but workers are encouraged to use the self-testing facilities.
As we have discussed, workers are required to participate in all different types of alcohol and drug testing except for voluntary tests. Consequently, as the slide demonstrates, a refusal to participate in alcohol and drug testing will be a breach of the policy. Avoiding or attempting to avoid random testing will also be a breach of the policy. Interfering with alcohol and drug testing may also be a breach of the policy. For example, tampering or attempting to tamper with test samples and lying or being dishonest about the conduct of a test procedure will breach the policy. Lastly, workers are required to disclose prescription or over-the-counter drug use before participating in a test. A failure to do that will be a breach of the policy.
This slideshow shows a range of breaches under the policy. We have already discussed these breaches in the presentation, but be aware there are additional possible breaches. So what happens if you breach the policy? This slideshow shows a range of possible consequences of breaching the policy. It includes termination of employment, exclusion from existing duties, a written warning, prescribed drug testing, contractual or legislative action. For example, your contract may provide for a particular process if you exceed the fit for work limits, or there may be a legislative consequence if you have a role that requires you to have a BAC of 0.00. Direction or referral to attend the Employee Assistance Program, or even participate in a return to work or rehabilitation program. Change of duties to a non-high-risk task, stand down from work, a direction to return home, or any other disciplinary action available under the disciplinary policy. The Council has the discretion to impose one or any number of these consequences, but will have regard to the circumstances of the breach, your personal circumstances, and consider what action is appropriate.
That concludes this presentation. If you have any questions, please direct them to your supervisor or manager. Now it is time for you to complete the questionnaire that you've been provided with to make sure that you have understood this presentation.